How do you deal with triggers? In this video, I'm going to tell you what you can do about triggers, if anything. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button so you never miss a video. New content coming all the time. One of the common topics I see in forums and discussions, especially on Facebook, is what to do about triggers. All the time I see stuff like trigger warning, trigger warning, trigger warning. It seems like everything is a trigger warning these days. Usually when somebody says trigger warning, it's like saying spoiler alert when you tell somebody what's going to happen at the end of the movie. Except in this case, it's usually a photo or a word that triggers somebody to feel or behave in a certain way. In this video, I want to tell you a few things about triggers and what I learned on my path to recovery. The first thing I want to say is it's important sometimes to take an inventory of all the triggers that you have. I remember at one point in the depths of my eating disorders, I had so many thoughts that were triggers and a long list of foods that were triggers. I used to call them trigger foods because if I had one bite, it was all over and I would binge. And I used to honestly believe that. Later I learned that wasn't the case and that I could eat anything I wanted without having to binge. But more on that later. Ask yourself where these triggers come from. There was a time in your life when all these triggers weren't triggers at all, and you didn't even think twice about them. My guess is that you started with one or two triggers, and the list became longer and longer as time progressed. For me, my first trigger was peanut butter. I don't know what it was about peanut butter, but it was just that creamy, fatty, gooey substance that I just couldn't resist. But over time, the list of triggers became more and more. And then it became ice cream, then it became sugar, then it became this, then it became that. After several years, there was almost nothing that wasn't a trigger. Certain thoughts were triggers too. Just the thought of going to a party or a social event where I knew there was going to be a lot of food that I couldn't resist triggered to behave in a certain way and to prepare for whatever event it was. I would get into this frenzy and I would be in this excited state and I would just lose all control. Or sometimes it would be the anticipation of a new diet or a new fast that would trigger me to misbehave and act in ways that I really didn't want to. A lot of times these triggers come from previous experiences. Our brains are constantly learning and constantly adapting to the environment. One experience can turn something into a trigger almost overnight. At one point in my life, ice cream and peanut butter weren't triggers and I could eat them freely. Over time, I learned that I would habitually overconsume these foods and then I labeled them as triggers. Do an inventory and be honest with yourself. Are these really triggers or are you just giving yourself an excuse to misbehave? My second point is triggers aren't things, they're just thoughts. If you think about it, when we talk about triggers, we're just talking about some word or some image or even some thought that makes you misbehave. But that's really all they are. They're just thoughts. They're nothing physical, they're nothing tangible, they're nothing that you can hold. So how is it that something has so much power over you? We hear a lot in this day and age about certain triggers, not just when it comes to eating disorders, but when it comes to politics and social issues. You see this a lot in college campuses. You have trigger-free zones. Just keep that in mind when you blame triggers for your own bad behavior. They're not really things, they're just thoughts, and they're not actually pulling you in any one direction. My third point is you create your own triggers. Like I said earlier in this video, at one point your triggers today were never triggers at all in the past. Through your own actions and your own decisions, you turn benign things and benign images into triggers. And every time you see an image or hear this particular word, you act in a certain way like an automaton. It's like somebody's controlling you like a little marionette. And I know this is somewhat controversial, but you kind of created this problem yourself, and you're the only one who can undo it. We create our own lives, we make our own decisions, and we move our hands and our mouths in particular ways. It might not always seem like that, but that's the hard reality. If you want to recover and you want to start changing your behavior, you have to accept responsibility for everything, and you have to assume that everything is your fault. And that brings me to my fourth point. Triggers can't make you do anything. My second point was triggers aren't physical things. They're just thoughts or impulses. And this is really important to understand because you can have a trigger in your life. You can see an image, somebody can say a word, but that doesn't really mean anything. Triggers aren't destiny. It might seem like that sometimes, but really all you're doing is you're hearing a word and you're just acting in a certain way. It's convenient to believe that triggers can make you do something. The reality is you're just making a wrong choice. I've gotten criticism in the past for saying that eating disorders are a choice and not just a disease. People are always asking, who would choose to live like this? It doesn't really make sense, but in the heat of the moment, it might make sense. It might make sense to choose to misbehave or choose to harm yourself because it's the most expedient thing to do, and it actually makes you feel good in the moment, even though it'll make you feel bad in the future. Why would somebody do this? Because it provides instant gratification and immediate relief from whatever you're feeling or experiencing in that moment. It doesn't make sense in retrospect, but when you have that choice, it kind of makes sense sometimes. If you've never dealt with an addiction or an eating disorder, it really doesn't make sense. But one of the keys to my recovery was taking responsibility for everything. I couldn't just blame triggers or certain foods or images or thoughts or certain sentences or phrases. I had to believe that everything I was doing was my own volition. Abnormal psychology and addictions don't make sense, but they are choices. The word trigger implies that you have no choice. But like I said, you chose these triggers. You created these triggers. And that's my fifth point. You are a free agent. You choose what you do. You choose what you do with your hands. You choose what you do with your mouth. You choose where you go. The problem with you is that you have impaired decision making. When you decide what to eat or when to eat or how much to eat, you're constantly weighing different options. And that's what your brain is. Your brain has what's called an option generator. Your brain generates all these different options, and then you have to select one of those options. The problem with disordered eaters, like I was, is that you have all of these options, and one of those options is to eat nothing, or to eat less, or to push yourself from the table. And the problem is you consistently choose the wrong option. And the solution is to start choosing the better option, even if that better option doesn't feel really good in the moment. Secret. Project yourself into the future. And when I say the future, not 1 or 2 years into the future, project yourself in 1 or 2 hours. How do you want to feel, and what do you want to look like? How do you want to feel in 2 hours? How much do you want to weigh tomorrow? And how do you want to look just a week from now? If you just think about future self and where you're going to be, it helps a lot. It helps you make better decisions today. And like I said, believing that you're a free agent is the first step to recovery. You can't believe that you have a disease or that every time you have a trigger, you have to act in a certain way. If you believe that, then there really is no hope for you. Then you're just a little mouse with electrodes stuck to your head. The truth is, you're a free agent, you're a human being, and you can modify your behavior if you want to. It's entirely up to you. When I was in graduate school, I used to have a little sign above my desk, and it said, "Everything is your fault." One of my professors stuck that in the middle of his packet. He didn't tell us, but when I was reading through the packet, I found it and I printed it, and it was one of the best things I did. Every time I wanted to blame a professor or something else for a bad grade, or when something didn't go right, all I had to do was look at that piece of paper that said, "Everything is your fault," and it made me feel a lot better. Everything is your fault. As long as you believe you have a disease and that you're beyond repair, then you really have no hope. It's uncomfortable to believe that you're making these choices on your own, but that's the sad reality. Eating disorders are really nothing more than impaired decision making. Your brain has learned to consistently make bad choices, and every time you make a bad choice, you get the sensation of reward. You actually feel good when you make bad choices. The only way out is to start making good choices. At first, making those good choices isn't going to feel that good, and you're going to want to say yes when you want to say no, and vice versa. But over time, it becomes a lot easier. Getting started is one of the hardest things. And if creating momentum and getting started is your problem, then look in the resources below. My next point is that triggers will always exist. You can't get rid of triggers. The only way to get rid of triggers is to go move on some island like Robinson Crusoe and live there the rest of your life. Although something tells me you'd still find some trigger on a remote island. In my case, my list of triggers kept growing and growing year after year. You can't get rid of triggers. We're inundated by advertisements and media and signs and notifications, phones. You can't get rid of triggers. Quit trying to get rid of triggers and start to deal with them in an empowered and mature way. It's like dealing with cravings or negative emotions. You can't get rid of them. It's just part of the human experience. And the only solution is to learn to deal with them in a constructive manner. One of my old friends was a CrossFit instructor, and one of the things he said was, get comfortable being uncomfortable. You need to be comfortable with negative emotions and negative thoughts. My challenge to you is the next time you see or hear a trigger, just grapple with it. I've mentioned this in previous videos on cravings, and it's super powerful. It's not very comfortable at first because you want to do something and you want to get rid of that craving or that thought. But usually that means harming yourself and making bad decisions, and then you just reinforce the cycle. My advice to you: quit getting rid of triggers and start to deal with them. I hope you found this useful. I know this is somewhat controversial and not everybody is telling you this, but this is the cold hard truth. And it's your only solution. If you don't follow these steps, you're just gonna be a victim of triggers the rest of your life. If you're struggling with triggers and you wanna learn how to deal with them in an empowered way, head to my website, eatwithcontrol.com. There's some free training there, and I'll show you 5 steps you can take right now to conquer junk food and sugar cravings immediately. Don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button. And because you stuck around, I'm gonna give you a bonus step. And my bonus step is grow up. We live in a really weak age. Everybody's offended, everybody's weak, everybody's outraged. We have an entire industry devoted to outrage and triggers. Well, I'm tired of it. Part of growing up is learning to deal with people who don't agree with you, and learning to deal with emotions and thoughts that are uncomfortable in the moment. Life is not always sunshine and rainbows, and we have to learn to deal with negative experiences and negative thoughts. Can't always use distraction and chemicals to deal with these emotions. And the solution is not to avoid it all. We have an entire generation of people who have been coddled their entire life. They've been told that they should never be offended and they should never hear anything that they don't want to hear. I'm a member of the weakest generation. Every day you're going to hear words and see images that you would prefer not to hear or see. But unless you want to be a hermit and go live in a monastery somewhere, you're going to have to learn to deal with it. People say things that offend me and piss me off every single day, but I'm an adult now and I've learned to deal with it. I still get urges and impulses and cravings for things that I shouldn't have, but I don't respond the same way I did. Now, why is that? That's because I learned to look at my menu of options and I started selecting better options consistently. It wasn't easy at first, but I learned how to do it consistently. Instead of arguing with people, I just shut up. Instead of grabbing something filled with salt, sugar, and fat, I do nothing. Instead of distracting myself, I sit in silence and I deal with the thoughts in my head. I encourage you to do the same. Grow up. I hope you found this video offensive and valuable. See you next time. Bye.